Welcome, dear learners. This is our session on communication research. We've already had a session last Tuesday talking about the basics of research, talking about where it all originated from and how communication research has been such an important part of media academics as well as media industry. Today we will continue our discussion from there. And just to recapitulate from what we did last time, research is needed because there are certain decision-making situations where we need to formulate a policy, where we need to take a brand-related decision or any such thing. So we need to research and then reach an informed conclusion. Then it is there to describe the media. We know how proliferant media is these days. It is important to understand the features, the things that we can put media and the kind of uses we can put media to. This is because this is what will explain to us how media becomes important in our day-to-day lives and how it establishes a connect with the audience and also how it has such a long-term impact on various audiences. So it is important to describe the media. Then it also helps in analyzing media effects on consumers. We know that whichever brand, whatever product or service wants to reach its consumers or customers, it is only through the media vehicles, which can be of various types. There are so many different platforms. There are OHH platforms, there is advertising, there is event management. There are all so many things that are there today under the plethora of various media. So these help in analyzing media effects, the way it is affecting the audiences in terms of the fact that audiences have turned into consumers of content as well as producers of content. So also they are consumers of various brands, of various advertising goods, so on and so forth. So it helps you to analyze how what kind of an effect media has on the consumers. Other than that, it also helps in understanding audience behavior. What are those special situational contexts during which an audience will accept or reject your communication? What is the kind of communication which will have maximum impact or effect on the audiences? So those are the reasons why we do research. Now we come to the basic idea of how we conduct our research. That is the focus of our session today. So the first thing is determining a relevant topic. How do you decide upon what topic you should choose for academic or, for that matter, industry research? First thing is the first consideration, whether the topic is too broad. Say for example, in this session I will try and exemplify as much as I can so that it is the learning is easily transferred onto you and you get to the concepts easily. So when we say, is the topic too broad? Say for example, you're trying to study the media use of housewives. So this is quite a vague topic because you have not defined the limits of this research subject. When we are talking about the media use of housewives, is it that we're talking about the entire subcontinent? Are we talking about India? Are we talking about North India? Are we talking about a state or two? Who is the target audience? We need to limit our research. So is the topic too broad? If it is, then probably it is not the perfect topic to research on. Can the problem really be investigated? A number of times it so happens that the issue that you're trying to investigate is concerning only a limited population. And if it is only that limited population which you're concerned about, then it does not have a larger applicability. And there are also times when the problem in itself is such that it cannot be investigated. So ideally, one has to decide upon those considerations while deciding upon a relevant topic for research. Also, are the data susceptible to analysis? Like, say for example, you're only talking about 10 people. And 10 people choose 10 different options as their responses to a certain thing that you're trying to investigate. Let us say media habits. So in that case, is the data susceptible to analysis? A little child may not be, or maybe a teenager may be using maximum social media as compared to an elderly who must be limiting themselves to television and radio. So what is the kind of data set that you have come up with? Is it significant enough to produce a certain result? Is it significant enough to make a statement at the end of the research as to what the answer of the problem is? That is important to analyze. Then, is the problem significant? I just related it to the susceptibility of data for analysis. When we say a problem is significant or not, say for example, need gratification from television for elderly citizens. If we are going to investigate on this problem, then we are trying to see whether there is a connection between the elderlies who have limited mobility, who would like to stay at home within the comforts of their environment, and what is the kind of connect they make with the media, the more popular one, which is the television. So is that problem significant? Are we coming up with data? Are we coming up with investigative facts which are able to state that there is a connect between the age group of people and the kind of gratification they seek from television? So is television as a medium able to gratify, satisfy the needs of the elderly population? Yes or no? So whether there is a relation between these two variables or not will be decided by the significance of the research problem. Then, can the results of the study be generalized? By generalizing, we mean that if the same study, if we do in some other place, say for example, this study was conducted somewhere in Delhi and Punjab and Haryana. If you replicate the same study down south, will the results be the same? Are the elderly population looking at television as a way, as a medium of gratifying their needs? Those needs could be any. They could be entertainment, they could be information, politics, whatever. So ideally, can the results of the study be generalized? Can we make it applicable to a wider population? Yes or no? That will decide whether the topic of your research is relevant. Then what costs and time are involved in the analysis? In my last session, I talked about academic research and I also talked about private research. So when we talk about academic research, obviously there are certain limits of cost and time and everything else as compared to private research, whereby certain brands fund certain researches in order to dig out how the audience behavior has been, what has been the acceptability of their product or service, and what can be improved, what is the kind of strategy that the competition is employing, so on and so forth. So costs and time that are involved in the analysis are important aspects so that some basic results come out at the end of the study. Then, is the planned approach appropriate to the project? The kind of research blueprint that you have made, the research framework that you have devised, is it appropriate to the research that you're looking at? Say for example, if we are looking at the violence index, rising violence index in children because of exposure to violent programs on television or on any other video on demand services or any other thing that they expose themselves to generally. So is there a certain approach that you have taken by which you will be able to measure the violence index and whether it is rising or not rising over a certain number of years? Like the kind of approach which would be proper for this kind of a study is a longitudinal approach, whereby you select a certain group of children and study them over a period of a few years, maybe 10 to 15 years. So time to time, every year you try and conduct a focus group interview, try and investigate and figure out in detail, or even through ethnography, you're able to figure out whether the violent tendencies in children have been rising because they have been watching certain genres of programs on the television or on screens in general. So that is the planned approach. So what is the kind of research framework that you've made for your study, and whether or not it is appropriate in application to that study? Then the next thing is there any potential harm to the subjects? There can be, okay, let us take an example, the same example that we've just discussed. If you talk of children and you're exposing them to certain violent programs, and in turn testing whether their ways of finding solutions of problems generally, socially, have turned more aggressive or violent. In such kind of a case, because you are as a researcher exposing the children to violent texts and violent programs, you are obviously doing certain kind of harm to their psyche. So this is in fact unethical also. So one has to figure out if there is a any sort of potential harm which is happening to the subjects, and you should avoid it. And that will also determine whether the the problem and the investigation is relevant or irrelevant. Then we come to the next thing. First we chose the research problem. First we chose what is it which will form the area of our research and what are we going to investigate on. The next thing we come to is reviewing the literature. In simple terms, if I explain this to you, if you have decided upon studying the violence index in children, yours may not be the first study which is happening in this area. Even if you have that speciality of conducting the first research on the violence index of children, probably violence amongst teenagers has been tested at some point of time in the past, or violence in women, girls, housewives. Any certain segment of the population has been tested already. So you try and dig out which are the relevant studies similar to your studies which have been done in the past. You study what objectives they began with, what kind of methods they employed, and what kind of conclusions or findings they came up with. So that is called reviewing the literature. So the existing body of literature is strong enough to be able to not only help you devise your own objectives, but also help you find out the gaps in the study. Because every research, whichever research it is, obviously will have certain limitations. Everything, every angle, every aspect cannot be investigated properly by one research itself. So in that case, this aspect which has not been investigated so far becomes the aspect which we call the gap in the study. And this gives you your focus of research. So you know what can be your subject which you would like to research on. So this is reviewing of literature. So it comprises of consulting the available literature, what was done, how it was done, and what were the kind of research. And what are the kind of results that have emerged from those studies, which have been similar in nature to the one that you are thinking to conduct. Then the most important step in research process is the facilities, it facilitates learning from previous researchers, what I just called the gap in research. And it also saves your time and effort and money. You need not rediscover the fire every time. You know where the body of research has already reached, what is the kind of knowledge addition that has already been made to this segment of media research or communication research. So you proceed further from there. It helps you save upon your time, it helps you save upon your effort, money, everything. Then, when you're doing this review of literature, what are the questions that you must ask while reviewing? One, what type of research has been done in the area? Say for example, violence index in children, what kind of researches have been done? Have they only studied the audience aspect, whether the violence index has been rising in the audiences, the children in this case, or it has not been having very considerable effects, or whether it has not affected at all? This is the audience perspective. Is there another kind of research which has been done? Have you tried analyzing the content which has been offered through cartoons or movies or any kind of content which is offered to children when you're studying the violence index? So you need to figure out what type of research has been already done in this area. Then what has been found in previous studies? Say similar studies have been done in the past. What is it that the investigators, the researchers have come up with as their findings? And then what are the suggestions that have been made by other researchers for further study, which I call the gap in study. So when you know what are the limitations of that research, you will work upon those limitations as something which can, propel your study forward and which can be the focus of your study. then which aspects have not been investigated so far? It is important to ascertain the aspects which have not been investigated, because if you're only testing the replicability of a research problem and in a certain set research framework, you aren't adding anything new to the existing body of knowledge. So ideally, since you're making all the effort of conducting this research, why not look into those aspects which have not been investigated so far? Then, how can the proposed study add to our knowledge in the area? I just spoke of how it adds to the gap in, discovering the gap in the study, and then when you conduct your study focused on that gap, you will be able to add to the existing body of knowledge. What research methods were used in previous studies? The kind of research methods that you employ, the kind of research framework that you make, is not only dependent upon the knowledge of the research methods and methodology, which maximum people would like to think as. It is also dependent largely on your common sense, because it is you who are going to decide that in order to get the solution to this particular research problem, what is the kind of method or a combination of methods which must be used in order to achieve the desired results. Say for example, you are trying to study the perception of a brand in a market. So it is not just enough to study what the audiences feel about it. It is also important to know that the brand managers who decided upon sending forth this communication to the audience, what did they have in mind? And how was it received in the market? Did it fail or did it succeed? In case it failed, what could have been the reasons of failure? So you also analyze the content. See, I'm making use of 3 different methods here. First, I studied the audiences. Maybe I employed the survey method. Then I took the perception of the brand managers as to what helped them decide that this is the best communication in which we must put our monies and which must go on to the audiences. So probably I employed the interview method. And then I studied the content, this communication itself, the message which has gone to the audiences, the ad which has been made, or the ad campaign or the event that has been created for them. So I will study the content and see, as a researcher, as an investigator, what do I find? How is it impacting my audience? What do I see it as? So that is the analysis of content. So these are 3 different methods that I employed here. So, the research methods that were used in previous studies and the research methods by employing which you will find the answers to your questions is important to gauge. The answers to these questions will help in defining a hypothesis or formulate research questions. We will come to hypothesis and research questions now. When we talk about a hypothesis, because what have we just done? We have just reviewed the literature, the existing literature in the area of our research. So basically we have tried to study which all sections of population have been studied, what is the kind of research that has been conducted, what kind of methodologies have been employed, and what findings did they come out with. We also have seen what are the gaps in studies and what are the limitations been in studying these areas. Now when we talk about hypothesis, now since we have studied so much, we are able to come up with an informed opinion. This informed guess is called a hypothesis. To define, it is a formal statement regarding the relationship between the variables and is tested directly. Now what do I mean by this? When I say that it is a formal statement regarding the relationship between variables, in case of say need gratification for senior citizens, the variables could be the television and need gratification and senior citizens. So it is the age, it is the medium that we are using and the need gratification sought. In the second example that we discussed about violence index in children, it is the interaction of children with the content, say for example TV content or any screen content, audiovisual content, and the rise or fall in violence index. So violence index is a variable. Age is a variable. So these are the variables based on which we create a hypothesis, an informed guess that greater exposure to violent programs leads to increase in violence index for the children. Now this at the end of our research can be proved right or wrong, both of which are equally important. If it is proved that when you expose children to violent kind of cartoons and violent kind of content, children become more aggressive in nature. That is equally important as saying that such kind of content or exposure to such kind of content does not affect in the long run, and children do not start getting a violent streak. They are not impacted in the long run. So that is an equally important research. So this hypothesis we formed based on the study that we've already done in the review of literature, and then in our present study which we are designing, we will either prove it correct or wrong. So this is what we call a hypothesis. So here the hypothesis being tested can come to be positive or negative or null. Then what is a research question? Now first let me tell you the difference between hypothesis and research questions. Earlier in researches, people used to make greater use of hypothesis only. The use of hypothesis has not been completely negated in researches today, but people have largely started making use of research questions. Now research questions are more direct questions which you are aiming to answer at the end of your study. So you either have hypothesis in your study or you have research questions. In order to just let you know the definition of it, they are formally stated questions intended to provide indication about something. So like for hypothesis, we said that increased exposure leads to increased violence index in children. That was a single statement hypothesis. If I have to frame research questions for the same study, what will they be? My research questions, one, can be multiple. Like a hypothesis, it is not a single statement. Now let us just try and coin some research questions. What is the kind of media exposure that children have? Do children like to view more of violent content, violent programs on television? Does violent program affect children in their day-to-day lives? So, in order to employ, you would like to have ethnography conducted, and you would, particularly watch a child for 15 to 20 days to see if the violent tendencies or aggressive tendencies are increasing in this child. So, those are the kind of research questions. They can be multiple. 3, 4, 5, there can be deeper. So these research questions or hypothesis, one of them is employed in a research study. These research questions are not limited to investigating relationship between variables. They will be able to answer more things. Like say for example, they will be able to answer, a research question can be, is there a government policy stating that any particular TV channel or any particular medium can only show X% of violent programs? You will also end up investigating this section, as a result of which you will be able to, at the end of your research, make a policy recommendation that government should decide what is the how much content should it allow on a daily basis, which can be violent in nature. It can be for any age group and it can be for any target audience. So it is not limited to investigating only the relationship between media exposure and violence index in children. Next, research questions are used when a researcher is unsure about the nature of problem under investigation. One thing is when you know that it is the media which is leading to increase in violence. It is not the fight that happens amongst peers. It is not the fight that happens between children, the siblings. So it is not that, or maybe violent tendencies in the family, in the parents, is not a reason. If you're sure about that, you're checking the balance between the exposure to violent content and the rising violence index in children. But when you're unsure, when you know there are other things other than media that people come to engage with and that people can be affected by, then you should, employ research questions. It helps in gathering preliminary data, the basic data. What is the kind of media exposure that a child has? What is the kind of content that he or she likes to view? That is the kind of preliminary data that we are talking about. Then it is a testable hypotheses are developed from research question phase. So for every research question, the important ones, not all of them, you end up making a null hypothesis or a positive hypothesis or a negative hypothesis, and then you put it to test during your investigation depending upon the data that you've collected, depending upon the tool for data collection that you've designed. And then once the data is collected, you will be able to infer the results in terms of whether the hypothesis of a certain thing has been right or wrong or how it has been. So this is one thing. Now we come to area of study and objective setting. When we talk about the area of study, the study area can be based on a few things like source and message and channel and receiver. Depends on the kind of study that you're trying to undertake. Area of study basically is the broad area which you will be choosing, under which you will choose what exactly you want to study. Like it can be based on source. When I say it has to be based on source, you answer the question, from where does a particular information originate? Like, I will discuss an example, brand managers' perception of social responsibility campaigns, a study of leading newspapers of India. Now, this is a research problem which is largely looking at the social responsibility campaigns that are carried out in the newspapers, the leading newspapers of India. And then why are we trying to target the brand managers? Because these are the people who handle such kind of communication, who design such kind of communication and strategize around it so that a brand may succeed in the communication that it is making. So ideally, we try to get the brand manager's perception. What does the brand manager feel about certain social responsibility campaigns that have appeared over a period of time, which we have selected in leading newspapers of India? So the source of information is important. That is one way of choosing your study area. The other is choosing by means of message. When we say message, it is basically the content in terms of text, in terms of audiovisual, in terms of audio, or even a combined of all, So we are analyzing the content. Most of the time, say for example, coverage given to science-related news in TV channels. So basically what you're out to reveal is what is the kind of, how much time on a TV channel is given to science related news in order to, build scientific temper in audiences in general, not just children, everybody. So there's another example here which says coverage of crime against women in national channels, a study of prime time news of NDTV and Aaj Tak. Here we are studying the content. The method that we will employ is content analysis. Now, what are we going to do in this? We're going to look at the total news content for a certain period, specific period, say for example 3 months or 6 months, and then we're going to gauge whether the coverage of crime has been good enough, has been considerable, or it has been left behind. Coverage of crime against women in national channels. So this is the checking of message, the analysis of message. This is the kind of message area of research. And then we have channel as an area of work. Channel also called medium. Now we know the differences that have arisen because media has percolated all aspects of life, be it business, be it entertainment, be it family, everywhere we have a presence of media. So there isn't an event that will not get clicked like a selfie or which will not get posted on the Facebook. All of them are what? They are all media. So we are trying to study print, we are trying to study radio, television, online and social media is a big area in itself today, or OOH, out of home, publicity and advertising. So there are all such kinds of media platforms, and when you're trying to study it from the point of view of the medium, you're basically trying to gauge which kind of content suits which medium best. Which medium is going to pay off in the best possible manner since a brand or anyone is investing into it. So which is the best way of reaching which kind of an audience? If you're talking about the agrarian places of villages, of rural belts, probably radio continues to be one of the best media to reach the audiences there. So if you have to deliver some message, or you're checking whether the messages are getting not just transferred but also accepted and implemented upon messages related to agriculture by the farmers, then probably studying the radio medium would be the best. Alternately, if you're talking about the literate belts of the country, you may be studying newspapers, and you could also study who are the people who have stronger political opinions, those who like to listen to TV news or those who like to read news in newspapers. So ideally, medium research in itself is also very huge in scale, so to say. Okay, there's another example here which says effect of OOH brand endorsement on consumers of consumer durables, a study of working class of Delhi. Now, it is important to notice what are the operational terms being used in this example. I say OOH, brand endorsements. So you would see a celebrity endorsing a brand over the highway on a huge thing. So that is out-of-home publicity, out-of-home brand endorsements. And they are not coming on your television, you're not listening to them like a radio jingle. You're just seeing them on a highway or one of the main busier roads of your city. So when it comes to consumer durables, is it that the working class would go for purchasing consumer durables based more on the OOH ads, brand endorsements, which they have seen around them? Why only working class? Because these are the people who will start every morning from home to work and will come back every evening. So they get exposed to these hoardings, the out-of-home publicity material. So does it lead to a purchase decision at their end, speaking in terms of the vertical of consumer durables only? Is that so? So this is a kind of research which will come up with the findings on the medium. Whether consumer durables should be best sold on TV, or should they be best sold on OOH, or social media is still better? What is it? Talking of the receiver section, audiences of all media are investigated whenever we're talking of the receivers. Say for example, we're trying to see who are the people who use social media more. Because social media is a platform where a lot of drama happens. The real life is different, and the drama and the life which is projected on the screen is much different. So audiences of all media get studied under this segment of receivers. Say for example, corporate social responsibility and image building, a study of NTPC Dadri. Now in this study, ideally what would you do? You would try and figure out what are the corporate social responsibility campaigns and what are the efforts that this concern NTPC has made, and how has it led to building the image of this organization. So you are going to the audiences in this area, in this case Dadri, and you are figuring out what are the efforts that this organization has made in order to ensure that their corporate social responsibility gets fulfilled, whether the audiences are happy with it or are they discontented, dissatisfied with it. So the entire thing will come to you as an audience research. So having spoken of the areas of research, we now move on to setting of objectives. Anything that you set out to do, if you've not set the objectives right in the beginning, there are less chances that you will be successful at it. More so in terms of research, because it is something which involves all your energy, and it is an in-depth thing which you do. So objectives and the way you set them, the clarity that you give to the audience as well as to yourself as a researcher by setting the objectives is very important. It will decide the course of your research, it will decide the direction, the orientation of your research. Now, when we talk about objectives of any research, they are basically bifurcated into one broad objectives and the other specific objectives. So when you say broad objectives, it could be, say for example, the need gratification that housewives obtain from watching soap operas on television. So now this is the broad objective, that entertainment, whether housewives are able to meet their entertainment needs on TV. through TV or not. This is a broad objective. When you talk about the specific objectives, you'd like to see housewives, what kind of interests do they have? What kind of entertainment needs do they try to meet on television? Why do they choose television as their source of meeting entertainment needs? How do they deal with social media in contrast to television? And what is the likelihood that they would shift from one medium to another in case the kind of content that they're looking for is available on another medium? So on and so forth. These can be the specific objectives, the specific questions, the answers to which you're trying to find by the time you end your research study. Another example which has been discussed here is designing the objectives of a research problem. Now, if we have to design the objectives of this research problem, which says gratifying entertainment needs of PG students, a study of FM culture in Delhi NCR. So what are the specific objectives? We first try to see what is the kind of media habit a PG student has in Delhi. How much time does he give to FM radios? And does the audience get affected by the messages that are delivered through this medium, FM medium? So the FM culture and how it has affected the youth, more specifically the postgraduate students. These are our specific objectives for this research problem. Now we will be discussing variables. When we say variables, ideally variables are those parameters, which you judge whether there exists a relationship between them, whether there is no relationship between them, whether one affects the other, whether the problem that you've chosen for yourself, the research problem, is being impacted in one way or the other by the variables, and how much, is one variable affecting as compared to others. So there are two basic things. One is the concept and one is the construct. Together they make variables. I will first discuss the concepts. A concept is an abstract idea which is formed by generalization from particulars. Say for example, as a researcher, you see that a person who is going to give a speech on the stage, before the time that he has given his speech, you would either find him fiddling with stationery, or you would find him moving his hands, or he would appear a little unsettled. So you will call this as speech anxiety, and this speech anxiety will become your concept. This concept you're going to put to test in your research, in which whatever kind of research that you're making use of. This is how. Audience involvement. When we say audience involvement, it is feedback. Whether there's enough feedback coming from the audience, whether the audiences who are consuming the content are also producing similar content. What are they making, what are they doing with this content that they are getting? So all these together forms audience involvement. On one hand, when I say what are they doing with this content? Are they sharing it? Are they making games out of it? Are they trying to emulate the same values or the same things in their personal lives? What are they doing? This is one aspect. Another aspect could be, if I read an article in a magazine or in a newspaper, wherever, do I give a feedback? Do I retort? Do I share it and say, okay, this is wrong? Minnesota, as of today in the United States, is facing a lot of racial discrimination, and there's a lot of brouhaha going on there. So is it right or wrong? My involvement as an audience, as a viewer to it. So all these aspects together can be clubbed into one concept. So this is how we make concepts. What is the importance of making these concepts when we're trying to figure out what variables are? One, they reduce the detail to be explained by combining particulars in general categories. Like I've just given this term TAFEs. Technologically advanced families. Say for example, I'm trying to do a research on technologically advanced families. How am I defining these technologically advanced families? These are the people where all adults have smartphones. They make use of social media. They have advanced television systems in their homes, and more than one in one family is existing. So I define these people as technologically advanced families. And the concept I give is TAFEs. So this is something which I'll have to explain when I'm, writing the report of my research, and I'll have to tell them why I have called them taffies, because this is not a very prevalent term. Then, you are able to facilitate communication amongst those who have a shared understanding of concepts. Say for example, agenda setting. So we all understand audience involvement in a certain manner. So communication researchers have a certain understanding of what is audience involvement. As compared to this, when you say agenda setting, everybody who is a media student or has been into the media field understands what agenda setting is. So this is basically something which will help us build a common understanding of a concept. This is why we call it a concept. And constructs are, we just discussed what concepts are. Constructs are combination of concepts. Now what are constructs like? One, the meaning of a construct relates only to the context being studied. Say for example, media literates. When we talk about media literates, we're not just studying audience involvement. We're also studying the way media, the way media affects the audiences. So media literates is a larger term which has combined these two concepts of audience involvement and this one. So media literacy or media literates is a construct. Being abstract, it cannot be directly observed. So you cannot come up with a study which says, okay, we have 70% media literacy amongst postgraduate students in the country. No, we can't do that. Why? Because media literacy in itself is to a large extent an abstract term. You will have to break it into concepts, measure those concepts, and then reach a conclusion. So it cannot be directly observed. So then what are variables? The empirical counterpart. Empirical means something which can be calculated, something which can be put into numbers. Empirical counterpart of a construct or concept. So constructs and concepts together make your variables. They link the empirical world to the theoretical. Usually what happens in research is you have a certain empirical understanding. You know that 40% of the population likes to use Apple phones, iPhones, as compared to the rest 60% who make use of Android phones. So you are trying to connect this to some theory. What is that theory? Maybe some theory of psychology which says that self-esteem of a person is also depicted by the lifestyle. So certain theoretical concepts and underpinnings you're trying to test by making a sense of it in terms of numbers, empirically. So they link the empirical world to the theoretical context. They can be measured or manipulated in research. What can be manipulated? The variables. So you know what is whether they are directly proportional to the effect they are creating or inversely proportional, or they have no bearings at all. A certain variable cannot affect the concept that you're out to test. Now, variables are basically of a few types. The first one is independent variable. Independent variable is something which can be manipulated. Like we were just discussing this idea of gratifying entertainment needs of PG students, a study of FM culture in Delhi NCR. So FM culture is an independent variable. It is not being affected by anything, it is just there. Right? And that is something which can be manipulated. How can it be manipulated? You can either, say for example, you have an experimental test to make. You can increase or decrease the exposure of your target audience, in this case the PG students, to the FM radio in general. Now, their values do not depend on the effects of independent variables because they can be manipulated. So, dependent variables are what the researcher wishes to explain. Their values depend on the effects of independent variable. Say for example, if the education level in any society is good, the income level will be good. So, there is a direct connection between the two. Or if the income is good, the lifestyles would be better. There is a connection between the two. Or if the exposure to violent programs is less, the violence index in children will be less. So we are trying to create a certain, these are called dependent variables. What is the dependence? The exposure to violent media content and the violence index. These are two dependent variables. Income, education, two dependent variables. Age and gender is not a dependent variable, it is independent variable. No. Now, the dependent variables are not manipulated. They can only be measured or observed, as in certain kind of situational context, whether they increase or decrease or they are not affected. How is it? So they cannot be manipulated. Like you could manipulate the FM culture. You could see if you provide less magazines to students in general, say PG students, they will read it less. So obviously you are able to manipulate the content here. You're able to manipulate whether you're providing more time and more number of magazines to them or lessening them. Then another is discrete variable, which cannot be divided into subparts. So what do I mean by that? Say for example, the family size. There can be 4 people in the family or 5 people in the family. There cannot be 4.5 people in a family. So that is a discrete variable where you're able to provide an absolute value to the variable. It is called a discrete variable. So also for population, so also for gender. You know, there are 3 genders and one can belong to either one of them. It cannot be anywhere in between or none of it. So these are called discrete variables. And then there are continuous variables. The way, you know, say for example, height. So somebody's height can be 6 feet 2 inches and somebody else's height can be 5 feet 10 inches. So it is 5 feet 10 inches is between 5.5 and 6. 6.2 is between 6 and 6.5. So these are continuous variables. They can be meaningfully broken into subparts and fractions. As compared to this, discrete variables, if you break it into certain categories, they will not have any meaning. So you cannot break a family size, but you can break the height. Another example can be time spent watching TV. So I spend 1 hour and 40 minutes watching TV as in contrast to my neighbor who spends 2 hours watching TV. So we can make it a continuous variable. So accordingly they are measured or made empirical in nature. So those were about variables. Now let us talk about sampling. When I talk about population or universe, it is the entire group of units to be examined. Like we took this example of need gratification for elderly by television. So all the elderly will comprise my population or universe. What is the unit? Unit is the smallest size of the universe to be studied. So a single elderly, be it a man or a woman, is my unit of analysis. Say for example, brand managers' perception of social responsibility campaigns, a study of leading newspapers of India. Let us look at it. Now, if we are talking about social responsibility campaigns over a period of, say for example, 6 months, each campaign is a unit in itself, and all the social responsibility campaigns are the population or the universe. Another example, coverage of crime against women in national channels, a study of primetime news of NDTV and Aaj Tak. Here, when you talk about the population or universe, it is about all the, all the channels and the coverage of crime against women in all the channels put together. But here we are dealing only with 2 channels, NDTV and Aaj Tak. So what did we do? We sampled it out. There was a universe, there was a population, we have sampled it out. Census is, what is census? Census is when you take the perception, the demographics and psychographics of every member of the population. So when you're examining every member of the population, it is called census. Now it is important to understand what's a sample. A sample is a representative subset of the population. What does that mean? If I'm talking about the Indian population and I've only spoken to, say, 500 people from Delhi or Mumbai or any other metropolitan town or city, how does it impact my study? It does not let my sample be representative. So those 500 people who belong to a metropolitan town or city cannot represent my rural belt, cannot represent the towns, cannot represent the urban people. So all of it cannot be adequately represented. So sample has to be representative subset of the population, should be able to adequately represent the entire population. And then when we take out a sample in a population, there is a theory of probability that we apply, which says that if the number of chances are equal every unit should have an equal chance of being represented. So say for example, if I have to choose a sample in a class of 60 students, amongst those 60 students, every student from 1 to 60 must have an equal chance of coming up as my sample. So the theory of probability says that the number of chances should be equal such that every unit is adequately represented. Now let us talk of the probability sample. Now probability sample is selected according to mathematical guidelines where the chance of selection of each unit is known. Earlier we were talking about theory of probability where we said that every unit is equally represented. And now we're talking about which sample will you call a probable sample, where the chance of selection of each unit is known. We know that out of the 60 students, every student has 5 chances of answering my question. And probability sampling allows the researchers to calculate the amount of sampling error present in a study. Now, when you apply statistical tools, this is slightly more advanced, but you should know this. Why are probability sampling methods better? Because it allows you as a researcher to know what is the exact amount of error which is occurring in a study. Non-probability sampling is slightly non-scientific. So we will just discuss what those methods are. So it does not allow you to come up with an exact calculation. Like at the end of my research study, I can say that my study is 95% accurate. So I have an error of 5% in my sample. But non-probability methods will not allow you to do that. Now let us look at the non-probability samples as well. The first non-probability sampling is convenience sampling, which takes into account the readily accessible subjects for a study. Say for example, shoppers in a mall or a group of students enrolled for an introductory media course. When I say shoppers in a mall, I could be testing which is the most liked lip color. I am a brand who would like to produce cosmetics and I've produced lipsticks. So I'd like to test which is it, because people who coming to a mall belong to a certain class. Now these are the people who have certain kind of tastes. So when I am talking to the women shoppers in a mall and I'm trying to figure out which is their best liked lip color, I am doing convenience sampling because I'm not giving all the women an equal chance of coming into my sample. Despite the fact that the entire, all the women together form my universe, but my sample is not adequately represented. But this is convenience sampling. Similarly, group of students enrolled for introductory media course. How much understanding do they have of media programs and so on and so forth. This can be helpful in collecting exploratory information, but it may have an unknown quantity of error. You do not know that people in South Delhi and the kind of choices and preferences they have. How do they differ from girls in Delhi University? So it may have an unknown quantity of error. The second is volunteer sample, when people are willing to participate in research projects, and this differs greatly from non-volunteers. It can be used for comparison test of products and services. Say for example, I have come up with a new brand of mobiles. So I say that any 10 people who would like to come forward and use this mobile instead of theirs for the next 2 months. So for this, I would require people who would like to volunteer. Most people would not like to part with their mobiles because they get used to, having that kind of mobile with them. So the third is purposive sample, which is selected on the basis of specific qualities or characteristics, and it eliminates who fail to meet the criteria. So say for example, I am talking to a section of people about ACs. Which do they think whether window ACs can be made better so as to include the qualities of a split AC? But this is again a purposive sample because I am talking only to those people who can afford an air conditioner. I am totally negating the population which does not make use of an AC. So this is selected on the basis of specific qualities, and there are certain characteristics which will help in eliminating those people who fail to meet this criteria of using ACs. Now, researchers select people who use a particular type of product and ask them to compare it with a new product. This is what happens in the previous kind of, in purposive sampling. Now we come to quota sampling. When we talk about quota sampling, the sample is selected to meet a predetermined or known percentage of people. So say for example, iPhone users. If I am conducting a research on iPhone users, there is quite a probability that I already know that only 40% of this population is making use of iPhone. The rest of them are all Android users. What does it indicate? It indicates that I am talking to only a certain selected segment of population, the quota. So there is already a predetermined percentage, 40%, 60% are not a part of my sample. So this again is a non-probability sample. Now let us talk about the probability sampling. Here so far we've spoke about the non-probability samples, and now we're talking about the types of probability sample. One is random sampling, maximum people make use of it. Each unit in the population has an equal chance of selection. That's fair enough, that's scientific. Selection procedure must be free from subjective intervention by researchers. So, if an American researcher is conducting research, shouldn't be saying that people of color will be omitted from being a part of the sample. No, there should not be, the selection of the procedure should be such that there should not be any subjective intervention by the researcher or by any other external factor at any point of time. Use of random table numbers. Now, just in case you've come across random table numbers, these are numbers, two-digit numbers that are just put together. And they're all random. There is no series, there is no order in them. They're just random numbers that have been put together. So when you choose, you say for example, you choose the number 6. That's completely random. So the 6th person in my class of 60 will come as a part of my sample. Then, what do we mean by systematic random sampling? Every nth subject or unit is selected from a population. Like when I chose the number 6 from the random table numbers, every 6th person will become a part of my sample. Another example, choosing a sample of 20 from a population of 100. Now, what is the sampling rate in such kind of a case? There are 100 people in all and we have to choose 20. So, the sampling rate becomes 20 on 100, 1/5. So we are trying to choose 1/5 as our sample size, 1/5 of the total population. What is the sampling interval? Every 5th person. So 5th person and then 10th and then 15th, 20th. This way we reach up to 100 and we choose 20 people who become a part of our sample. Then sampling frame. Sampling frame, those are the terms that you should know when you're conducting a research. Sampling frame is the complete list of members. When you have the complete list and details of all these 100 members who are your population, that is called a sampling frame. And the degree of accuracy is directly proportional to the adequacy of sampling frame. The more adequate the sampling frame, the total list of the population, the greater is the degree of accuracy. There is a greater chance that there will be less error in your research. Now let us look at stratified sampling. There are a number of times when you cannot combine all the categories. Say for example, when you talk about the preference of cosmetics amongst men and women, or for obvious reasons you cannot combine the two. You will have to make them into two stratas. You will have to come up with findings of men as differently from that of women. So age, gender, religion, income, all of these together, can be stratified. So homogeneity reduces this sampling error. The more the similarity between the people, say for example, similar age groups, similar gender, the greater the chance that there will be no sampling error in it. Then we have cluster sampling. This is about selecting a sample in groups or categories in absence of complete sampling frame. So like we wanted to decide upon the color, the lip color for the lipstick. So we went around talking to people, the women in the mall. So you'd only select a sample in groups or categories in the absence of, because the complete sampling frame is absent. So you have to see to it that you make it more and more random. You make it in a way that every section of the population is equally represented. Like that was a non-probability sampling example. But if the same case has to be conducted, you should be speaking to the students also, you should be speaking to the housewives also, you should be speaking to the working women also, you should be speaking to the metropolitan people as well as non-metropolitan people. So that is how you make a holistic sample. Now, two kinds of error may enter while we are talking about a cluster sample. The error could be in defining the initial clusters. How are we defining the clusters? And then how are we defining means what are the things, the variables that we're taking into consideration for measurement. And then there can be an error in selecting from those clusters. You have, say for example, you're talking about the non-medical students of various schools. So how do you cluster? Do you cluster into South Delhi, West Delhi, North Delhi and East Delhi? Do you not consider central? And when you're choosing schools out of, say for example, Central Delhi, there could be 15 schools there. How do you make a choice of 5? So the error can be entering in 2 stages. One could be while defining whether, which all schools should you take. Should you only take the KVs? Should you only take the private? Should you take a mix? So first of all, you need to define the initial clusters. And then the error in selecting from the clusters. 2 places where error can enter. Like the magazine reading habits of people in Delhi. For nationwide studies, multi-stage sampling is also used. So at various levels, say for example, you've done this kind of a school sampling that we are just talking about in this example for Delhi. Similarly, you will do it for all metropolitans on a similar basis. For all SEC B class towns, socioeconomic classification, on the basis of which we classify towns and cities. So SEC B class towns can be classified differently, C can be classified differently, so on and so forth. Now the last thing that I want to discuss today is deciding which method to use. We just came across probability methods, we just came across the non-probability methods and how we put them to use. But how do you decide which method should you use? All non-probability methods are not wrong. It depends on the kind of data you're looking to collect, and it depends upon the kind of objective you're wanting to meet. So the first thing that decides which method to use is the purpose of the study. Investigating variable relationships or collecting exploratory data. Which of the two are you doing? Are you investigating variable relationships? Then you better make use of probability methods. Are you only collecting some exploratory data, some descriptive data for designing or measuring instruments? You may make use of non-probability. Then cost versus value. How much cost are you ready to incur and how much value will that research come out with? What is the time frame that you have? The amount of error that is allowed. Like in pilot studies, a certain kind of error may be allowed because the pilot study may not become a part of the entire study, and non-probability method would do. So the amount of error that is allowed, the cost and value constraints, the time constraints and the purpose of the study. Those are the 4 things which help us decide whether we should be making use of probability methods or non-probability methods. Learning excites thought. Happy learning, keep thinking, try researching. Thank you all very much.